The world has seen this moment before. A wall that looked permanent, a regime that looked eternal, and then cracks. Today, Iran is standing at the edge of its own tear down the wall moment. Not because of slogans, not because of speeches, but because fear is breaking faster than the streets can contain it. Just months ago, the Islamic Republic was exposed as something fragile, paper strength, borrowed power, protected more by silence than by force. Now the people are back, week after week, not asking, demanding. This is not just about Tehran. This is about what happens when a system loses its patrons, its myths, and its grip on reality. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When walls fall, they don't fall quietly. If you want to understand why this moment matters, not just for Iran, but for the global order, stay with me, because what comes next explains everything. This didn't start in the streets. It started years ago, and that's where we need to go next. To understand what is unfolding now, we need to strip away the noise. This is not a spontaneous revolt, and it is not simply about anger. This is about legitimacy collapsing under its own weight. For decades, the Islamic Republic survived by controlling three things: fear, information, and external enemies. When the economy failed, ideology filled the gap. When services collapsed, repression stepped in. When people questioned, the regime blamed America. That formula worked until it didn't. What changed is not just hardship. Iranians have lived with hardship for years. What changed is belief. The belief that the regime was strong. The belief that foreign patrons would save it. The belief that resistance was futile. The 12-day war shattered those illusions at once. The state survived, but the myth did not. And once a myth dies, power becomes expensive. Every protest costs more to suppress. Every day of silence weakens control. This is no longer a crisis of policy. It is a crisis of system design. And to see why, we have to go back, not to last year, but to the origins of this cycle. To understand this system, you have to see its rhythm, not as ideology, but as a cycle. Since 1979, the Islamic Republic has operated on a simple exchange: submission for stability, silence for survival. Oil revenues funded control. External enemies justified repression. Revolutionary legitimacy replaced performance. For a time it worked, but cycles decay. As sanctions tightened and mismanagement deepened, the regime stopped delivering basics. Food became uncertain, water unreliable, fuel political, currency unstable. Each failure demanded more force. Each crackdown required more isolation. Then came the dependency shift. Instead of reform, Tehran turned east, toward China. The 2021 strategic partnership promised protection, energy for investment, loyalty for survival. But this was not an alliance of equals. It was extraction masked as partnership. China took resources, technology, influence. Iran took dependence. And dependence is quiet until the moment it's tested. That test came with war. And when the system was hit, something vital was revealed. The cycle had reached its breaking point. Because history doesn't repeat forever. It escalates. The breaking point arrived suddenly and violently. The 12-day war was not supposed to end this way. On paper, the regime had defenses, allies, deterrence. In reality, it had theater. When Israel and the United States struck, the illusion collapsed in real time. Systems failed, responses stalled, silence followed. For years, the regime had warned its people, America is weak, Israel is afraid, China has our back. None of that survived contact with reality. The B-2 strike was not just military, it was psychological. a message written in precision and speed. The regime survived. But survival is not strength. Inside Iran, something shifted. People saw what the state could not protect, what it could not prevent, what it could not explain. And just as important, they saw who did nothing. China, the great patron, stayed silent. No intervention, no rescue, no shield. That silence spoke louder than bombs. Moments like this don't create revolutions. They remove the excuses that prevent them. If you're beginning to see the pattern forming, you're not alone. This was only the first rupture, because what failed next was not military, it was invisible. Power doesn't collapse where you expect it to. It collapses where it's hidden. For the Islamic Republic, that hidden core was control. Not tanks, not missiles, information. After 2019, the regime learned a hard lesson. Bullets stop bodies. They don't stop coordination. So it imported something more effective from China. The National Information Network, the so-called halal internet, a system designed not to inform, but to isolate, to disconnect Iran from the world and citizens from each other. When protests ignite, the switch flips. Internet gone, messages silenced, truth fragmented. It's expensive. It strangles an already failing economy, but it buys time, and authoritarian systems live on time. This is how modern repression works. Not mass arrests first, but digital suffocation. Yet even this mechanism has limits. You can't shut down a country forever. You can't starve an economy without consequences. And when people realize the system fears communication more than crowds, they learn where the real leverage is. That's the danger moment, because once the mechanism is exposed, every shutdown becomes an admission of weakness, and the regime is running out of places to hide. The next shock didn't come from above. It came from the streets. This time, the streets didn't empty. They filled. What we're seeing now is not a replay of 2009. Back then, hope surged and faded. This time, endurance replaced optimism. Why? Because collapse became personal. When Tehran can't provide food, when water runs dry, when fuel becomes rationed, when currency loses meaning, protest stops being political. It becomes existential. The regime underestimated this shift. They expected fear. They got fatigue. Fatigue is dangerous. Tired people don't retreat. They stay. Day after day, numbers held. Voices stayed loud. Coordination survived despite blackouts. And once again, the outside world mattered by its absence. No bailout arrived. No Chinese lifeline appeared. No emergency rescue. For years, Beijing was framed as the alternative to the West, the reliable partner, the quiet guarantor. But when pressure peaked, that partnership evaporated. People noticed. When a regime loses both performance and protection, it enters a narrow corridor. Suppress harder and risk implosion. Loosen control and lose authority. This is the second crisis, not explosive power, but sustained defiance. And sustained defiance changes how people see themselves. Because now, the question isn't, can the regime stop us? It's, why should we stop ourselves? Now the cost is no longer abstract. It has a face, and that face looks like you. You feel it when prices change overnight, when savings evaporate without warning, when the lights flicker, when water stops running. This is what systemic failure feels like at ground level. For years, the regime asked you to endure, to sacrifice, to wait. Wait for sanctions to lift. Wait for deals to work. Wait for China to deliver. But waiting became a trap. And when people realized no one was coming to save them, something hardened. Fear didn't disappear. It transformed. It became resolve. You're not protesting because you believe victory is guaranteed. You're protesting because the alternative is permanent decline. That changes everything. This is why internet shutdowns haven't worked, why intimidation hasn't cleared the streets, why fatigue hasn't broken momentum. When daily life becomes unbearable, risk becomes rational. And the regime knows this. That's why it's afraid of your connection to each other, to the world, to truth. If this story resonates, don't look away. Share it, talk about it, because silence has always been the regime's greatest ally. What happens next doesn't stop at Iran's borders. It never does. What happens inside Iran never stays inside Iran. History is clear about that. This uprising sits at the intersection of power blocks, and every crack sends shockwaves outward. For China, this is not a side story. Iran is energy, leverage, a node in a larger strategy to challenge Western influence. Cheap oil, strategic depth, a partner willing to absorb pressure in exchange for survival. But instability breaks that equation. A collapsing Iran is not a reliable supplier. A distracted regime cannot project power, and a population in revolt cannot be easily managed through technology alone. The failure of the National Information Network would not just hurt Tehran, it would expose a Chinese export model of digital authoritarianism, one already being studied and copied elsewhere. In the Middle East, allies are watching, so are rivals. If Iran's system falters, the balance shifts. Proxy networks weaken, energy routes wobble, deterrence recalculates. And for the United States, this is a strategic inflection point. Support too little and lose credibility again. Intervene recklessly and validate old narratives. This is what makes the moment dangerous and decisive. Because the outcome here won't be written in Tehran alone. It will be read in capitals around the world. And that brings us to the future. Not one future, but three. There are three paths forward. None are clean. All are consequential. The first is collapse without transition. The regime fractures, power vacuums form, repression intensifies, then misfires. The system survives, but hollowed, unstable, dangerous. This is the worst outcome, not because change fails, but because it fails violently. The second path is managed stagnation. Protests are contained. The Islamic Republic adapts just enough to survive. Internet control tightens. Economic pain becomes normalized. China remains involved, but cautiously. Support without ownership. Influence without rescue. Life continues, but smaller, harder, meaner. The third path is the one history remembers. A legitimacy break. Not overnight, but irreversible. The regime loses the ability to command belief, not fear, belief. Elites hedge, security forces hesitate, people stop pretending. This is how walls actually fall, not with one push, but when everyone realizes they don't need to hold them up anymore. Which path emerges depends on choices made now, by leaders, by patrons, by people, and by whether pressure is sustained or allowed to fade. Because systems don't collapse from opposition alone. They collapse when maintenance becomes impossible. And that brings us to the final question: what this moment ultimately demands of us. History rarely announces itself. It whispers until it doesn't. This moment in Iran is not about ideology. It's about exposure. A regime exposed as brittle, a patron exposed as absent, a system exposed as unsustainable. For decades, the Islamic Republic survived by outsourcing blame to America, to sanctions, to enemies abroad. That script is worn out. What remains is a simple truth. Power that cannot provide, cannot protect, and cannot persuade eventually collapses under its own contradictions. Walls don't fall because they're attacked. They fall because no one believes in them anymore. And belief, once gone, never fully returns. What happens next will define more than Iran's future. It will test whether authoritarian systems, backed by technology and silence, can still outlast people who have nothing left to lose. This story isn't over. It's entering its most dangerous chapter. If you want to understand the world as it's actually changing, not as it's presented, stay with this channel, share this analysis, and watch closely. Because when walls start to crack, history moves fast.